welcome to another episode of Ufahamo Africa, a podcast about African life and politics. I'm Gopolang Botlhokwane. Africa's premier soccer tournament, the Africa Cup of Nations, or AFCON 2023, has come and gone. And for most of us, the appropriate word to describe the scenes of jubilation we saw in Abidjan after the host Ivory Coast turned what looked like an inevitable knockout into victory would be joy. But the bigger story of the tournament, as is often the case with the continent, is war. After 2 civil wars and years of tension, there were fears that remnants of past conflicts might disrupt the tournament. But if you're a football fan, you'd know that very few things can rival the following and respect that football commands in the continent. For Ivory Coast, AFCON was a sole production, or what the Guardian's Jonathan Wilson calls healing the scars of civil war. We talk a lot about the transformative power of football as the most popular sport in the continent, or what Paraguayan writer Eduardo Galeano calls the miracle. But we don't always know what that miracle looks like in the absence of a messianic figure or a player who plies his skills in the more richer leagues of European football, like Egypt's Mohamed Salah or Senegalese international Sadio Mane. Ivory Coast was perhaps one of the few times we got to see the social potential of the sport in the absence of celebrity or popular figures. But there were other notable things about the tournament that spoke to the growth of the sport in the continent. South Africa's shocking performance, knocking out favourites Morocco, was one. South Africa's performance was striking because the national team has also come to resemble the slow collapse of the South African state. This was also an expanded format of the tournament that allowed a significant number of smaller countries like Namibia to have their moment. To make sense of the tournament and the politics of the game in the continent at large, I had a conversation with journalist and editor Njabulo Ngidi. It's worth noting that our conversation is biased towards Southern Africa since it's where we are both based, but football in Southern Africa is, of course, informed by a continental context. We often joke that in Africa, football is more than a sport, it's a religion. And there's some truth to that joke. When I contacted Ngidi, I was curious as to whether we could somewhat rely on football as a kind of tool to gauge the mood of a country, in this case, South Africa. As someone whose work often interrogates the intersection of culture and migration, I'm particularly interested in the plight of South Africa's migrant soccer players. These are the men who traveled to Johannesburg imbued with dreams of football in stardom. In the early 2000s, players like Zambian international Colin Bezuma were rock stars in South Africa. We did not care about their nationality or which border they crossed. But the country we love is unraveling in unprecedented ways, and one is bound to ask, can football or soccer save us in the same way it might have saved Ivory Coast? As someone who's followed African soccer for forever, let's say forever, what were your expectations going into this one? I thought it was probably the best we've had. I don't know. For me, it was, I don't know. I don't think it can compare to at least the recent ones we've had. I think this was the best. And I was just curious as for you, what were some of your expectations? Would you say, how would you rate it basically?
I mean, for me, it's the best AFCON I've watched. And I've been watching it since '98. It provided so much because I mean when the expansion of moving the tournament from 16 teams to 24 happened, a lot of the purists were like, this is going to dilute the quality of the game because now you've got almost half of the continent qualifying. So there'll be a lot of sort of substandard teams that's going to mess up with the quality. But it just risen, even from 2019 in Egypt, which I was lucky enough to go and cover. The quality of the tournament has just been going up. And I think the one thing that I sort of been happy with, it's giving teams that wouldn't have had a chance to qualify an opportunity to do so. Teams like Kenya, Uganda,
Namibia,
Mauritania, Madagascar. Yeah, and when they come, they raise their game because I think for me, the AFCON, what makes AFCON special is just the heart and the stories that come out of it. It's not a tournament that is won by the most tactically acute astute team around. It's a tournament that's won by a team that's got the biggest heart representing your country. There's so many problems that we have in the continent that some of those things can look at DRC, for instance. They went back home, push them to go up and reach the semifinals, and even use that platform to highlight the genocide and stuff that is happening in DRC. So it's things like that that it just those stories that touch your heart, and even Ivory Coast. I mean, they were dead. They were terrible in the group stages, and they looked to be out, and were able to rise, come and do amazing things. So for me, I think it's the quality of the football and what drives people that really stands out for me in this tournament. Okay.
So, yeah. So, I just wanted to ask you about South African soccer, right? So there was a time in South Africa where we had these rock star migrant players. I'm thinking of Mbezuma and others, right? And I am just curious as to whether a lot of what's happening off the field, like politically with nationalism, xenophobia, do you think it has diluted that? Has it, right? Do fans look at these players differently now because of what's happening off the field, or is it still the same? Because I get a sense that a lot of what's happening off the field affects how we look at some of these players. I don't know if I'm reaching there, but I don't know what's been your observation.
I'm sorry, there's some parts that I didn't get. You saying?
No, I'm just asking.
In terms of the impact of the field stuff.
Yes, like xenophobia, for example. Do we still look at migrant soccer players, right? In the same way? Do we still, or is there? Have you noticed something different now? Do we look at them differently now than we did, say, back in the 2000s, or is it still the same? Because I do know there was a time where we didn't care. We didn't care if you were from Zambia or what. All we cared about was that you were good on the field, and that in a way helped us to connect more, more with each other. So I'm just curious as to, as nationalism or xenophobia becomes intense outside the field, has that impacted how we look at those players, or are we reaching how they are perceived?
I think, it's an interesting question. Because I think one of the things that I mean, obviously because football is the most supported sport in the country, but it's always interesting to see that in some of the xenophobic matches, you would find that there's always someone wearing a football jersey among those marching on, saying that they don't want whatever nationality and whatnot. Yet you'd find that their team, like the star players and even some of the backbone of the team, really are people from outside the country. And it's always been interesting for me to see that how you can say this one is good, but that one is bad. And I think it doesn't have a strong influence in terms of the football and how we perceive Bafana. But it has some form of impact in terms of when you look at the PSL, especially at this AFCON, where the PSL had the most representatives than any other league in the continent, which is telling because I think the PSL is one of the most important leagues in the continent. It might not be the best, but it's the most important because it attracts talent from all over Africa. And it's open. You find obviously in places like Morocco and Egypt that maybe they're on par with us in terms of money, but in terms of openness and sort of being a home for everyone, the PSL is by far the best. And that has always been interesting in that you have a league that is very open to players from across the continent, that a lot of them are flocking here by the numbers. But as a country, we're not very open towards migrants because of sentiments and some xenophobic sentiments, with some fueled by government, ANC people, and even some opposition parties. So you find that football, in a way, leads the light to a degree in terms of having of openness and being a welcoming place. Because I think what makes the PSL so important is that it's very hard for goalkeepers of Black and African goalkeepers to go and play abroad. Because there's still those stereotypes that they're not good enough for the era Poron. So in terms of making a better living and sort of playing at a higher level, most of them that sort of ceiling is South Africa. It's a place where they're going to get good money, be exposed to a wide variety of audiences. You look at Stanley Nwabali, for instance. He wasn't a key figure of Nigeria before he came to play for Chipa United, and he played here, and the coach came to watch him train and play for Chipa, selected him, and was one of the standard players for Nigeria, a team that had only 2 Africa-based players. The other was the third choice goalkeeper. And there's so many goalkeepers like your Richard Oforis, your Onyangos, your Kazapua. There's so many goalkeepers from Africa who are here making a good living and raising the standards. And there's been a call to say we need to cut that and ban African goalkeepers and just have only South African goalkeepers playing, which is something that Egypt does. But the PSL has sort of said no, like it's not something we're going to do. It's an open market, and the diversity we have actually helps our goalkeepers to grow and be better. And that sentiment, I mean, when you look at the xenophobic sentiments in the country, saying there's a ban on international goalkeepers is something that was going to be celebrated, as going to be a populist move. But football didn't. It did something that was good for the game and the country. And that's where I think at times football does lead in sort of trying to fight the scourge of xenophobia. I just think it's not doing enough. I think it could be more purposeful in its approach, because some of the things are just a coincidence or because of the bottom line. But if football really pushed to fight against xenophobia and to fight against gender-based violence, a lot of change would come in the country.
So you do say that PSL is one of the most important leagues in the continent, right? And I wanted to ask you about, I would say that it's also one of the most inconsistent in some ways, because I wanted to ask you about the thing of selling clubs, right? Because clubs are an identity of the league, right? If you speak about the Premier League, you speak about Manchester City or United or Liverpool, right? So in South Africa, we have this thing of selling clubs, and these aren't just, or selling statuses of the club, and these aren't just ordinary clubs. I mean, I'm thinking of Bloemfontein Celtic, and Bloemfontein Celtic was more than just a club. It was, I think, one of the most vibrant, right, teams of its time. And I just wonder, does that have an impact on the quality of the league itself? Because for me, it's very inconsistent. I don't know, right? One day you have a Chipa United, the next you have a Gopolang United or something. So I wonder if that affects the league, and whether the people who run the league care about that, or it's just if you can buy, and whether, because that or there are certain clubs that are reserved that would not be bought because their brands are so big, and then others can just be bought, and whether that's, I don't know, does that affect the league in any way, the quality of the football itself, but not just the football itself, the culture around the league? Sure.
It's a major problem in South Africa. It does affect football on a number of things and reasons. And I think, and it's a very layered thing, because on one hand, it shows how good the PSL is and where our football is, that it's able to attract so many people who want to be a part of this. I mean, when you look at some of the club owners currently in the team, in the PSL, I mean, you've got the Remgro group of Johan Rupert, you've got Patrice Motsepe. I mean, it's people who bring in terms of resources like proper money that could dramatically. I mean, when you look at the investment that Sundowns have made in the game, that could really take our football to the next level. But then you also have, on the other hand, people who are in it for vanity projects. I mean, you look at, for instance, the Royal AM people who bought Celtic. I mean, it's a shame in terms of what happened to Celtic, with such a rich heritage and history and such a massive part of our football, to be turned to essentially a club that at worst feels like a content for a reality show. I mean, you look at them, obviously, before they bought the club, there were accusations that the money that the owner, Mamkiza, got was through not delivering houses for people who needed them in some parts of KZN. And now that money is sort of being flashed. Also the same with the owner of TTM, who there have been accusations of corruption leveled against him. And he bought another team that had rich history, Veds, that was on the verge of turning 100, bought by someone who couldn't even keep up the club for 5 years, ended up selling it, and it was renamed to Marumo Gallants. So this thing is bad on so many levels. I mean, one of them is that history is being eroded because you've got teams with such vibrant history that are being sold for parts and turned into vanity projects. I mean, TTM and Royal AM, to be blunt, are vanity projects. It's not people who you can see that they'll be in SA football for 10, 20 years to come, or are passionate about this. It's about them and getting this flashy project or whatever. And that's sad, because there are some people who are really genuinely in it for the love. One of them is, for instance, the Free State Stars owners, the Mukwenas. They went through hell and back to keep that club afloat, and just couldn't financially, and end up forced being to sold it. And Free State has contributed so much to SA football. I think it's sad that we're at this level where now you can sort of buy your way to the top, because the other thing that it makes, that this makes a mockery of relegation and promotion. Because now, I mean, one of the beauties of football is that anyone can get relegated. It doesn't matter about your history or the stars that you have. Tomorrow, Chiefs, Sundowns, or Pirates could. But when you can buy your way back to the league, that essentially means only poor people can be relegated. And that's sad. It fits the whole point of football.
Is that something that would happen to a bigger, more significant, in terms of history, I guess? For example, a Kaizer Chiefs is that something that would happen, or is it because there are people who are saying it seems as if there's a limit or a unspoken line to say that certain clubs can be sold, but if I don't know, I'm just curious as to whether something like that might happen to a more significant or bigger team. Would that happen?
I mean, from the look of things, it looks like anything is possible. Because the owner has to be willing to sell. That's the only thing, because our clubs, there is no ownership of community. And I think that is also one of the challenges, that the owner can wake up and decide that I'm now, because they part of the board or whatever, they control it, they can sell. The fans can protest. I mean, you saw with Celtic, there were a number of protests. They even shut down Bloom at some point, and it looked like they had won. But because the owner didn't want to be part of this, there was nothing that they could do. So it's possible that the following day, Chiefs or Pirates could not exist. But it's unlikely to happen because of the heritage they have. And if they ever were to get into financial difficulties, there's probably a number of people who would be willing to keep them afloat. Because the thing is that at the end of the day, most of the clubs, they sell because it's not financially viable for them to keep it anymore. Ved sold because Bidvest had disinvested from the club, and it was hard for them to keep because they were players who were on high salaries and so many expenses. They just couldn't be able to sustain it. The same with Celtic. The owner couldn't sustain the club because running a club in the league is expensive. You might get 2 million grants, but there was someone who was saying that you need in the region of 4 to 8 million a month to run a team. And when you look at getting 2 million, that means you've just gotten half of what you need.
Yeah.
So it's a really tricky business in terms of what it takes to survive. But for me, the one thing that I find disheartening about it is that there is no control over it. Because I understand that in terms of the business sense, you've got someone who can't keep this brand and someone who wants to buy, which is okay. Then they should be allowed to buy and sell. But there should be some sort of control in that. One, if you're relegated, maybe you can't buy status in the higher league in the next 10 years. Because then what is the point of others fighting for the 30 games and working their way off when you can just flash money and go back? And I think also if you buy a club, there should be that if you bought this club from Mpumalanga, it can't relocate.
Yes.
Because this club is part of the community, you have to come and sort of stay there. If you don't want that, then buy a status in the province that you're in. Because I mean, for instance, you look at the stadiums and the infrastructures that are there in the country. The reason why today Rustenburg and Northwest doesn't have a club in the in professional football is because someone decided to sell Platinum Stars. The same with Mbombela. The reason why, I mean, Test Galaxy is a team from Mbombela by name. They aren't based there. They train in Joburg. Most of the things they do there. So essentially, Mbombela doesn't have a team, and the reason why they don't is because someone bought Mpumalanga Black Aces and relocated them to Cape Town. So you've got now two provinces that don't have clubs in the top flight football with great stadiums and good community and through no fault of their own. So why then, what incentive is there for those people to support the game when a lack of appreciation or caring of the fans?
So then I guess it's safe to say the PSL we have a money problem in the PSL, or a neoliberal problem, we might call it that, because you speak about the struggle of sort of maintaining or managing a team, a professional club, and I'm thinking of Morocco Swallows, right? And what recently happened to Morocco Swallows. And I was hoping maybe you can speak a bit about that, maybe link it to what you just said about the struggle of running a team. I'm also thinking that Morocco Swallows is a team that was actually bought, right? They bought another team. They bought a status to become Morocco Swallows, and then they struggled to, so which is quite interesting. So I was hoping you could speak about what happened there and whether the PSL is they seem not to be taking notice of, or I don't know if they don't care. You know, they in many ways the PSL, like SAFA, they seem to reflect, they have ANC tendencies, right? The ruling party tendencies where, you know, I don't know, there's a similarities there with how the ruling party behaves and how these organizations sort of carry themselves. But speak to us about Morocco Swallows, what happened there. And I don't know. It was, I mean, one of the things I heard was that the players were given marching orders because many of them are old, right? Or they've passed their prime. And I don't know if that's even a good enough reason to disqualify someone or fire someone. But what happened there?
Yeah, I think the Morocco Swallows story represents the worst of SA football on so many levels. Because you've got this team that has a rich heritage. I mean, in terms of history and pedigree, Swallows are up there along Chiefs, Pirates, and Sundowns. They've got, I mean, in the Nedbank Cup, the teams that have won the Nedbank Cup the most are Chiefs, Pirates, Sundowns, and then Swallows, which says a lot about their history and pedigree. And I think Swallows are among a few clubs that have won this tournament in its different iterations. And when you look at it, it starts from how they were relegated, because they were relegated because of financial mismanagement by Leon Prince, and they were heavily reliant on the investment of I forgot his name, but it's a German guy, I think Dick Bock or something. And when Prince had to run the club on his own, it became a challenge, and then the club then went down because of obviously financial things, from Premier Division, First Division, right up to SAB League. And they couldn't gain promotion back to where they wanted to be. And they bought their way back essentially, to going back to the First Division, and then they won promotion on the pitch. But it's one of those things that you sort of see the pitfalls of people sort of buying their way back, because it doesn't seem like that the PSL has a long-term thorough look at who's buying it. Is this someone who's going to be able to maintain this club for the next 10 years, for instance? Because it's not been long since Swallows bought their status, and now they're involved in these financial problems. So you've got that. That's the first problem. They didn't really earn their place where they're at. They bought and fast-tracked their way there. And even through that purchase, there was a lot of putting wool over the fans, in that. So the club, so the people who bought Swallows, they at first they couldn't operate as Moroka Swallows because Moroka Swallows owed a lot of money. So they operated as Swallows FC. Because they own the club, they could get away with that. No one could sue them for copyright. So while they're addressing those financial issues, they were operating as Swallows FC. And then when everything was done, they could go back to Moroka Swallows, which essentially means that this is not the real Moroka Swallows. The real Moroka Swallows died in the SAP League. These people are trying to sort of revive that by working on the love and the support that Moroka Swallows had, and sort of pretending that this is a version of it. And that's another problem. The other one is that there have been accusations that when the club came, the players were on very high salaries, something that they couldn't afford long term. And that's where the current problem is now, where the club has been unable to pay players for a couple of months, and sometimes not even getting the full salary. The players' union said that because they couldn't honor their last two games, which has never happened in the history of the PSL, where a team can't show up. So when that happened, there were players who were said to be on strike, and the club was going to punish them. In doing so, the club has said that they were renegotiating with those players to say, okay, our disciplinary hearing says we should fire you, but we don't want to fire you. We'll renegotiate, and you'll get a contract at a lesser salary than what you're earning. I mean, that's what was put forward by the players' union of what was happening based on their interactions with the players. And that, if that's true, that's deceitful on so many levels. So that is another problem in terms of living beyond your means. And then the other one is Swallows had got a sponsor of, I think, Telkom. Yeah, everything was done. And and that would have helped the financial burden of the club. But the league said no to them being sponsored by Telkom because they already have MTN. So because they're in competition, they thought that that was going to dilute the value of their sponsorship. So now you're turning, I mean, in terms of trying to help clubs become independent and sustainable, you're putting in these blocks that sort of hinder that. Because, I mean, the worst I think that could have happened with that, with the Swallows being sponsored by Telkom, is that maybe if they play in the Telkom knockouts, they don't show Telkom. We've seen that happen before when Orange was sponsoring the Champions League, where teams were sponsored by telecommunications like Pirates, like Alali, would play with a blank shirt. So that doesn't affect the sponsorship in a way, but the club still has money. So you've got so many things in the game failing, and that's what led to the situation of Swallows. You've got a team that tried to live beyond their means, a group of people who didn't want to go through proper channels of working their way up to the first division where they needed, and also a PSL that doesn't have proper checks and balances, and also at times become a hindrance to team being self-sustainable. And that's what led to this problem. Like it should, for me, the Swallows thing, it's not just about Swallows, it's about SA football in general. It should be a warning that this is where we are going if we don't address these problems that we have.
Yeah, I guess then it would be fair to say South African soccer or football is somewhat in crisis. I'm thinking of SAFA here because there's another house of, I don't know, there's another house in chaos, right?
Yeah.
There's another house, and you know, I was reading your Mabugani piece, and I was like, it sounds like there's a lot going on there, right?
Yeah.
You know, I thought maybe you could speak a bit about the chaos at SAFA. I don't know. I see it as a chaos, and
it is. And it's sad. I mean, I think SAFA, that's also another organization that's on its knees when you look at the financial challenges they have. And the sad thing is that, based on the investigation I did for that story, is that a number of those problems are brought onto SAFA by themselves. I mean, one of the things is that you have an association that is in financial difficulties and trying to cut the fat wherever they can, to a point where some things are operating through the bare minimum. Yet their NEC has been growing exponentially throughout that process to a point where it's costing, I think, in the range of like 10 million a year. So if you, because it's ridiculous that you can find yourself to have an NEC number that is almost on par with your staff, because the NEC is the board. So when you've got a situation where your board is on par or just level with your employees, there's something seriously wrong in that organization. And those are some of the things that are happening at SAFA, where money is not consistently going where it ought to be. And that's why we have these problems, because I mean, even the purchase of the technical center, it's ridiculous. There were accusations that they bought it at inflated prices. And it's the state of it is bad. I've been there in the story that I'm working, is that I mean, the grass pitch is non-existent. The hotels, no one would really want to stay there. That's why Bafana and Banyana don't. So you've got, I think, almost 100 million essentially now thrown down the drain in that investment, when there's so many viable places that could have been bought for a technical center and would have done less in terms of upgrading that. So it's an organization that has a history of mismanaging its finances, and it's slowly getting to a point where it's being exposed. And I think the sad thing is that the success of Bafana and Banyana and even our teams in the PSL, they mask the problems that we have in our
yes.
football that need serious attention. And I mean, it shouldn't get to a point where teams are unable to show up that we address these things. But because the teams are doing well and we're seeing results, then we ignore the loud alarm bells that are ringing when we should be addressing these things. Like what happened to Swallows should cause a matter of urgency to say, let's talk. How do we get this? How to ensure that no team gets to this position? The same at SAFA, in that we've spent so much money and we're not seeing it. How do we change things? How are we able to address and get sponsors? Because I was having a chat that yes, Bafana have done well and we've sort of fallen in love back with them. But I don't see many corporates investing big money for Bafana because of how SAFA have been managed. You will find corporates that need that exposure, corporates like Lecoq, 10 Bed, who just want an opening in the market, and can sort of ignore all the other stuff because they need this exposure. In terms of getting a corporate investment that can invest hundreds of millions in these teams, it's near impossible based on how they've been ran. And we need to be urgently addressing that for the future of our game.
So we have like 5 minutes. So I thought I should just squeeze in one more question. You know, these associations, right? Like this football association tend to, there's a lot of politics there behind boardroom politics, right? And I wonder if SAFA runs the risk of a civil war, basically, a boardroom civil war, if we may describe it like that, at the rate it's going, because so many people on the ground, the coaches, right? A lot of people on the ground are unhappy with what the top brass are doing. And I'm just wondering if you could quickly maybe speak about it. Is that a possibility in the near future, at least? We will have a time where someone says a certain group that belongs to SAPA say, no, we are sitting this one out, or we are going a different direction. I know there's already been sort of friction between the PSL and SAPA. So I'm just wondering if we might see something like that at the rate we are going.
I don't think so. I think with the history and what we've seen is that most people have been vocal when they've left SAFA. There have been very few dissenting voices that have spoken when they're at SAFA. And that's one of the things that I've put forward to some of the people who are critical of Jordan and this current administration, that you were there, you enable this, you're part of the problem, but now you're finding your voice and conscience when you are on the out or have been pushed out, which for me is you can take it with a pinch of salt to say that when you were in this cushy position and were trying to do things and the things that could be done right, what were you doing to change this? Because a number of them were not, even though some were speaking obviously within the association, there were none voices that were dissenting outside. And that's the challenge, is that people find confidence in their voice once they leave. And that, I mean, that is very revealing. Like, yes, you might be raising things, but you're not doing enough when you are inside. And that's where change can come, because no one from the outside is going to change SAFA, sadly, because of how it's structured. That's why Lucas Radebe can never run for SAFA president, because for you to run for SAFA president, you have to belong to a SAFA structure, a SAFA branch. So you have to be within. The only people who can save SAFA are SAFA. And the problem is that we have not seen enough of them, that we have enough of those people within the association to be able to rescue it. I think it's going to take something dramatic, and I dare say the minister dissolving or doing something. And then the challenge with that, obviously, that it raises the eye of FIFA, who are going to accuse government of government interference, and that could lead to a suspension of our national teams. But I don't think SAFA is going to change on its own. There has to be some drastic changes made, whether legally or in terms of government, for things to be better, sadly.
A quick one in a minute. So Bafana was made up of mostly Sundowns players. There are people who are saying that is not really good. What do you say?
No, I mean, that's that's madness. I think the core of any team, I mean, we've seen it in other countries. You find that because Sundowns have been playing in the continent quite a lot, they've had this pedigree of playing at this level. So it makes sense that you build your team around that. We saw it with Germany that won the World Cup, that it was built around Bayern Munich. The same with Spain that won the World Cup. It was built around Barca and Real Madrid because they're dominant forces. So it's something that has been done worldwide, because national team coaches don't have time with these players. So you try and sort of work on the understanding and gelling that is there. And also, there isn't anyone who's been picked from those Sundowns player who you can say they don't belong there. I think it's a good approach in terms of making the most of what is working.
No, Njabulo, thanks.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com. This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, Harry Stoltz, and Michere Muguero. Our non-resident podcast fellows are Ami Tamaklo, Fu Sedu, Exidi Olagu, Basil Ibrahim, and Gopolang Botlhokwane. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.